Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1162 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. So guys, I have a actually insane theory about this chapter that's probably going to dovetail this entire review. I just don't want to start the video with it. But my god guys, there might be something here that is as wacky beyond your imagining. So I'm just preparing you ahead of time. Copious amounts of tinfoil required. Anyway, this chapter was very chaotic. I kind of felt that way reading it. I've seen some people say that as well. It was just super fast paced, and I think one of those chapters where rereading it has a lot of value. But honestly, I didn't hate it because it fits so well with what is actually happening. I'm not entirely sure if I've ever actually used the word clusterfuck in a One Piece review, but I'm using it now. Because dear God. Following the last chapter where we saw Rayleigh save Shocki, now they have to escape with her. We get this mini panel of the island itself and where all the main characters are, and Roger's literally like, look, Navy's that way, Rocks Pirates that way, we need to go the other way. But yeah, I would say despite this setup, I'm left liking the Rocks Pirates even more than I did. Or at the very least, the leadership of the Rocks Pirates. Maybe this is just the best time possible to reflect on everything that we have said or speculated about the Rocks Pirates before now, and just blatantly point out how absolutely wrong we were about them, at least so far. But look, I'm not going to totally blame myself here because I feel like I was just kind of in line with what the community as a whole thought. Got myself some receipts too, because Morge is on record saying that a lot of people saying Rocks isn't even a villain. Of course he is. Anyone whose goal is to become the king of the world is automatically a villain. Rocks is just so damn charismatic that readers love him despite his selfish goals, and that is exactly what makes him a phenomenal villain. Well, look man, is Rocks actually a villain at this point in the story? I would not be so certain. And also talking about selfish goals, you could also be talking about Luffy. But anyway, I'm not intentionally trying to throw shade specifically at Morge because I feel like he just expressed what most of us, or at least a lot of us, were thinking. Rocks is destined to become the bad guy if for no other reason than we know that Roger and Garp teamed up to face him. That alliance makes no sense unless Rocks is really the bad guy. Therefore, this clouds our judgment. But we'll talk more about Rocks. Boy, will we talk more about Rocks. But this even applied to the dynamics of the Rocks Pirates. We were told, or it was suggested pretty early on, that there was a lot of infighting between the Rocks Pirates, and this added up with actual contextual details within the mainline narrative. The former members of the Rocks Pirates, such as Big Mom and Kaido, did not really like each other. So basically, we demonized them. We looked down on the Rocks Pirates. It's pretty consistent throughout the story that the quote-unquote good guys, as we would see them, are not fractured crews. Rocks Pirates may be individually strong, something that could rival the Roger Pirates, but as a pirate crew, it is just so flawed. There is just no way that something like this could end up representing the good guys. The whole deck was stacked against them. So we're all, or a lot of us, are just sitting here waiting for this to manifest, even if it seems like it may be a bit uncertain beforehand. But yeah, I suppose to get to the point, I think that this chapter is a huge kick in the nuts. This was Oda's opportunity to really demonize and villainize the Rocks Pirates, and he really chose not to. Basically, the entire premise is that the vast majority of pirates here, which includes the Rocks Pirates, are here for Shocki. Suddenly, Rayleigh is the one that saves her. She is the great treasure, or the greatest treasure, one of the great treasures in God Valley. It would then make sense for villainous pirates to attempt to take the treasure that does not belong to them. That was also part of the last chapter where Oda is very clear that Shocki belongs to Rayleigh and vice versa. If you wanted the Rocks Pirates to be the villains here, it would be very simple. We will 100% root against them if they try to take Shocki. So Rocks himself, is he here for Shocki? No, he's not even in the same vicinity. He's doing something else because his priorities are different. Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard, are they here for Shocki's love? No, they're not either. But wait, hold on a second. We do know that Shiki is actually here to acquire Shocki's love. This is the perfect character to really start driving home the Rocks pirates. So instead of this, you see the Rocks pirates grunt say, beat Rayleigh and take Shocki, and it is in fact Shicki who says no. You cannot do that because Shocki would get hurt. This treasure is not ours, but there's still other things up for grabs. Lol. Oda mercilessly laughs in the face of agenda. And even if you want to argue Big Mom to be a pseudo-villain here because she took the dragon fruit from Ivankov, she could have done so much worse to Ivankov if she wanted. Same with Kuma. Again, once he ate the fruit, the treasure became his, and Big Mom, like Shicki, backed off. So as I promised at the beginning of this review, eventually we will create a whole-ass headcanon for how all of this might work. But I do believe that it is time to finally say this without any asterisks and without any doubt. The Rocks pirates are the heroes here. It will likely change, but everything leading up to this moment is what it is. Our preconceived notions of the Rocks pirates were wrong. And I do feel as though this was the next thing that Oda began to emphasize within this chapter. People are fighting everywhere, it's total chaos, and then we go back to the Marines. They ask Garp for orders, then we pan back to Garp and he says, hey Sengoku, did you know this was going on? And Sengoku says, there was one man who reported some rumors, but he vanished from the Navy's ranks. Over the last few weeks, there has been so much slanderous discourse regarding Garp, and I'm glad that Oda gave him this moment. They're talking about their sudden realization that these celestial dragons are the villains here. I'm assuming that Sengoku is being honest. He may not be, but I'm assuming it. So they both, even as very high-ranking famous Marines, did not know what occurred during these hunting games. And I believe that this is something that Oda implied in the last few chapters through Dragon's experience. Dragon essentially being on the island while the hunting games were occurring was not supposed to be how it was supposed to go. Likewise, the only reason that Garp is here as well is because the pirates attacked. This is probably what has made this event different than anything prior. But anyway, I suppose that you get it, and eventually Garp says, so what is justice on an island where everything has gone crazy? I think that he's very much struggling with the realization that the pirates are the heroes here. They represent justice, something he is trying his hardest to refuse to believe. So I'm very much hoping to see a number of apologies to Garp in the comment section. Is he still a flawed character? Yes, he is. Ultimately, despite what he has observed here and he's learned here, unlike his son, he does not choose to fight the celestial dragons, and you can criticize him for that. But don't take away that man's humanity. He is, in fact, actually related to Monkey D. Dragon and Monkey D. Luffy. This is hurting him. But anyway, let's rewind for a second and go back to Shocki and Rayleigh, because there is a somewhat mysterious line between them near the beginning of this chapter. Shocki just looks like she is in heaven being carried by Rayleigh, but Rayleigh says, Shocki, there's something I need to say to you. And Shocki says, don't say it, I already know. Look, I totally understand how people will have different opinions about this sort of panel in the story, because it's pretty unlikely that Oda will ever officially explain it within the panels itself. Like, we might get an explanation for it at some point in an SBS or something like that, but this will likely remain ambiguous for a time. But I personally like when Oda doesn't hold our hands and allows us to put the context clues together to figure out exactly what this is saying. You guys should already know I very much enjoy playing this game. And in this case, I have a very strong opinion about what Rayleigh and Shocki are saying. So in my opinion, a fact that we know is following God Valley, right? Shocki does not become a member of the Roger Pirates. She never claims to be a member of the Roger Pirates, and that's never described to be the case, which means that we know following God Valley that Rayleigh and Shocki go their separate ways. That is, despite the fact that in the past 2 chapters they have confessed their love for each other. So to me, it's pretty likely that what Rayleigh wanted to tell Shocki was, I love you. However, I have an adventure that hasn't been completed yet that I must finish. But Shocki did not need him to say that because she already knew. So look, guys, you can think about this however you want to, I suppose. You know, some of this could be very clever writing on Oda's part, given that we've seen, for instance, the Roger Pirates recruit Odin. Shocki is not there. So he's already created a universe where Shocki did not join the Roger Pirates. So perhaps this was a decision he needed to make for the story to make sense. Maybe you would prefer it if Shocki had just joined the Roger Pirates because look, I mean, she loves Rayleigh, so why not fight with him? Either way, it is what it is. And it seems like Oda found it important to allude to this occurring. But yeah, just from my perspective, how I prefer to read the story is when I encounter situations like this where it's kind of subjective, I'd rather fill in the missing details in the story which help substantiate it than cling on to some hypothetical that I perhaps would have liked better. So just as an example, Shocki has been through a lot. She's been a slave for a year. She may just be done with piracy. And I think that it's important to correlate all of what is happening right now with eventually discovering the One Piece. In essence, Shocki has found her One Piece. Her One Piece is Rayleigh. That was the great treasure for her at the end of her pirate adventure. Which is basically another way of saying that Shocki's adventure is over. If she believes in Rayleigh enough to believe that he will take care of himself and survive to the end of his own adventure, then she has no reason to continue being a pirate. At the very least, this is how I make sense of this story in totality. But continuing on this train of treasure and women, the other woman that we need to talk about is Aerys. So over the last few chapter reviews, we have talked a lot about Aerys, but I made sure to say, covering my bases here, we don't know anything about her, basically. Now we finally do. And it seems as though she is poised to become the next extremely well-written female character. But first things first, I really want to give credit to Oda and his process for writing this story. So if you guys remember to the last chapter review, we spent near the end of that review talking about something that Oda does commonly, which is parallels and foils. And we talked about that regarding Aerys, and we posed a hypothetical of what kind of character she could be and how it would relate to, for instance, Shocki. It just seemed incredibly obvious to me that Aerys and Shocki would be paralleled and foiled in various ways. And the same would be true of Shanks and Blackbeard. And that panned out in this chapter. But it's incredible to me that we can essentially know how Oda writes the story, but still be unable to 100% accurately predict what actually happens. We know that Oda parallels and inverts constantly, but we don't know in which ways. So the concept that Oda went with in this chapter is with Shocki, as an example, Shocki was saved by Rayleigh. She is literally being carried away to safety by Rayleigh with a dumb, happy smile on her face. And this is directly contrasted with Aerys. Rocks is in fact trying to do this very same thing, and Aerys doesn't let him do it. Oda made this extremely clear when he eventually had Rocks say, well, it wasn't on my bingo card that I would be the one saved. Aerys tells us that if I was the kind of helpless woman who could only cling on to you, the word choice here is very fitting, and couldn't protect a single child, then you wouldn't have fallen in love with me, would you? So I both called this and also got this completely opposite in the last chapter review, but I'm not really mad about it at all. Shocki wanted to be saved by Rayleigh, and Aerys wanted to save Rocks. Or at least something to this effect. We'll speculate more on this in a moment. But yeah, I think you guys already know that I love speculating about these sorts of character dynamics because to me, it's just fascinating how people are different, while at the same time actually being the same. If we haven't said this enough recently, we're gonna go ahead and say it again, right? The story of One Piece has a lot to do with dreams or desires. Another way of saying what you want or what you treasure. And something that I find to be true most of the time, at least it's easy to say that this could be true, is that we want things that we cannot have. Things intrinsically become more valuable the more difficult it is to possess them. This is the root of our society in a nutshell, right? You take things that are relatively plentiful and available, and you make them unavailable so that we fight each other for them. So the way that the dynamic between Rayleigh and Shocki worked is Shocki was always the aggressor in pursuing that relationship. Rayleigh was unavailable, pretty much the only man that was unavailable to her, and of course that was the man that she wanted. Also not a coincidence that Rayleigh decided to pursue her back the moment that Shocki became unavailable when she was captured and sold into slavery. We'll all take for granted and value less the air that we breathe until it's taken from us. But the value really hasn't changed at all. air is necessary for us to live. So value is a concept of the mind. But the idea is essentially that we desire or we dream for things that we do not currently have. So Shocki literally spent years of her life coveting Rayleigh, and this was likely the person that she dreamed for. So what is depicted in this chapter is everything that Shocki had always wanted. She wanted Rayleigh to value her as much as she valued him, and he's proving it here by risking his life for her. It could also potentially be argued that Rayleigh desired a woman whom he could protect and save. The relationship didn't really start until those circumstances were triggered. It's as though Rayleigh finally realized that Shocki needed him. Maybe Rayleigh wanted to be needed. And in all of their years prior, Rayleigh never felt like Shocki needed him because everybody else was always there for her. So I think that this is pointedly different, but also the same between Aerys and Rocks. Rayleigh officially chose Shocki when Shocki needed to be saved, and Aerys tells us in this chapter, it seems like Rocks officially chose her when he realized that she could save herself. Once again, she tells us, if I was the kind of helpless woman who could only cling on to you and couldn't protect a single child, then you wouldn't have fallen in love with me, would you? Frankly, you could dig deep down into Rocks' character and probably find this concept to be true for him on a number of different occasions. Rocks values people who can take care of themselves, who are themselves very impressive and competent people. This is probably how Rocks saw Shocki initially. Despite her being this great treasure that everyone coveted, Shocki was also a very impressive person. This also applies to the rest of Rocks' commanders, the other pirates, Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, etc., right? They're just the best of the best. King Harold. This just appears to be something that Rocks loves in people. And is straight up extraordinarily Chad, let's be honest. So essentially, I'm under the impression that Rocks began to view Aerys as this kind of exceptional person, which is beautiful if you really want to think about it. So this is what he valued in her, and she knew it. She basically thought that he would think less of her if she allowed him to save her like this. So the way that I look at it, at least for now, is that Rayleigh wanted to be needed by Shocki. He found value in the relationship with the realization that she needed his help. And I think that Aerys and Rocks is the same, but flipped. Look guys, so far Rocks' story is pretty heartbreaking, and it seems like what is happening over and over again is that Rocks wants to be helped by other great people who can actually help him. The problem is, such as in the case with King Harold, he can't easily obtain the love of these sorts of people, likely forcing him to live much of his life alone. I honestly think that Rocks became very good at relying on himself, and it's probably how you would explain the person he's become and his individual strength. Maybe you can even think about Rocks as another version of Shocki, who needed help, but just never got it, so figured out a way himself. Rocks is over here passing notes to King Harold, come and get me. It just never happens. But he did desperately want King Harold to be there for him in his time of need. So at the very least, I really like the thought that Aerys understood Rocks at a level that no other character really did. This is literally true love. She wanted Rocks to need her. She wanted to be the one to save him. And it's literally over here breaking my heart thinking about what is likely to be the ultimate consequence of this dynamic. Like everybody else that Rocks coveted in his life, she needed to be strong. And I think that we all have a very strong suspicion, at least, as to where Aerys' adventure ends. Here. But if you really wanted, we could attempt to go even deeper and basically say what I just said is wrong or not quite the truth. Which is really fitting for a guy like Rocks that seems to know everything about the world, but certain details here or there he's missing. He's got a lot of the truth, but not quite all of it. I think that you can relate to this conversation to Usopp and earlier on in the story, the Straw Hats and Luffy. Luffy is the monstrously strong guy that needs help. He literally expresses this in the Arlong Park arc, right? There's so many things that I cannot do. I can't lie, I can't wield a sword, yada yada. So Luffy needs his crew. I think that Usopp, similar to Aerys, understood this, but perhaps failed to value his lies in the same way that Luffy clearly did, because he mentioned it outright as a thing that he couldn't do, that he needed help with. Also, the thing about value crops up here again because Luffy is the guy who cannot lie, therefore values it, while Usopp is the guy who constantly lies. It's very accessible, so he doesn't value it. Instead, he values the thing that he does not possess, which was strength. But of course, we understand that Luffy never wanted Usopp to do things that Usopp couldn't do. That's not how the dynamic of the crew works. Luffy never loved Usopp because of his strength. It was literally his outrageous stories. It was just something that Usopp had a lot of difficulty understanding, because they value things differently. And I would imagine that there's probably something similar here between Rocks and Aerys, some misunderstanding. You know, as just one example, I don't know the answer for sure, but something that intuitively makes sense to me is what Rocks values in Aerys is not her strength, it's instead her bravery. Perhaps her fearlessness. I could just imagine a universe where Rocks is secretly a guy that is full of fear but just masks it really well. So eventually he finds a woman who is in fact extremely weak but just doesn't act like it. I think that you notice a very, very similar dynamic between King Harold and Rocks the first day that they met in Marriage Wall. Rocks encounters King Harold, is like, boy, are you lost? Right? You're a giant in the Holy Land. What in the world? And then from that day into the future, what did Rocks do? He coveted King Harold's friendship and love. I know people out there hate this sort of analogy, but it's true. It's literally love at first sight, Rocks and King Harold, just aromantically. So then hypothetically, it's perhaps easy for Aerys to believe that, look, she's, taking care of herself. That's why Rocks fell in love with her, but it wasn't quite right. Either way, we could speculate all day, but these are the sorts of thoughts that I have that really enrich the story beyond what we are literally given. I like that this allows me to parallel the hero Luffy with the hero Roxy's back, and at the same time makes all of this all the more heartbreaking. But I guess last thing I'll say on this is Luffy expresses the qualities about the crew that he values in Arlong Park. So it's just interesting to think about, like, does Rocks value Big Mom's greed, Whitebeard's lack of ambition, these sorts of things. But please play this game for yourself because the combinations are infinite. But I suppose it wouldn't really be a Joy Boy Theories review unless we attempt to talk from both sides of our mouths, because look, like, I go down these rabbit holes and it sounds all very convincing, but there's so much possibility in everything that is happening. It's the possibility that I love and I want to share with you. The not knowingness of everything is very exciting. This is quite literally the appeal of adventure for the sake of the adventure. So I definitely still want to entertain the notion that Aerys is not quite the person that she's presenting herself to be in this chapter. Take yourself back to Water 7 before we got the reveal that members of Galley Law, such as Lucci and Kaku and Khalifa, before they were revealed to be members of CP9, like literally the moment before they took the masks off, Oda made it as difficult as possible to speculate what ultimately becomes the truth, because he literally drew Kaku and Lucci's dead bodies. It was a lie, but that was what the panels conveyed. Oda is a master at this. And because of all of this, I have a whole lot of PTSD, and I kind of see shadows and enemies lurking everywhere. You never really know when Oda might smack you in the face. So I just have a gut feeling here that something like this is possible. I'm not sure that I can believe it at this moment, but it's just possible. I just think that you should always be asking questions and hopefully find some sort of satisfying answer. The questions that I have right now that I still don't have satisfying answers for is how exactly did the world government and Garling come to find out that members of the Davy clan were in God Valley? This is likely to be a treasure or a secret that was protected for hundreds of years, potentially 1,000 years, right? The Davy clan sort of erased themselves from Imu's view. Then, coincidence or not, Rocks falls in love with Aerys. Shortly thereafter, the Davy clan is discovered. Oda has so far omitted this sequence of events, and I find this to be kind of alarming. Another question more related to this chapter itself is we see that Imu, or the God's Knights, have transformed the other members of the Davy clan into literal demons. We'll talk more about this eventually, but this has happened, and somehow Aerys and Teach are spared. How exactly were they uniquely capable of being able to escape this fate? Once again, Oda decides not to describe this story to us, and that is at least somewhat alarming. And the last thing that we do not fully understand yet, but is implied at the end of this chapter, is we see a conversation, I presume, between Emu and Saint Saturn, in which Emu asks Saturn, "Is Rocks dead yet?" Literally, the celestial dragons are having a hunting game. There's all sorts of treasure strewn about this island. It's incredibly important. You're being attacked by pirates everywhere, including the Roger pirates, and what Emu seems focused on here is rocks. As I said, I believe that this implies that what Emu really cares about here, what Emu really wants or treasures, is the death of rocks. I still believe that Emu has constructed this entire event to entrap Rocks, which I love because I feel like this is where the story should go. We began Rocks' aspect of this flashback with his declaration of war against Emu, right? It's therefore fitting that Emu is still waging war against Rocks, and that is like this battle has been low-key unfolding, culminating in this. So I am anticipating that Emu has a hand in some of the circumstances which led to it, and if you think too much about that, offers up a lot of possibility, including the idea that Aerys is actually secretly a subordinate to Emu, was tasked with making Rocks fall in love with her, having a child with him, and yeah. So at the very least, I find it to be possible that Aerys' objective in this chapter is not really to save herself. It's to separate herself from Rocks, so that Rocks, who is this ungodly superhuman person, right, who would not successfully be able to protect her. While Rocks is around, he is simply too strong. Aerys would be unable to die or even fake her own death. You may find this to be overcomplicated and therefore unlikely, but I find this to be a tragedy in its purest art form. With Emu, the conductor of evil, he wanted Rocks to be able to taste his dream, get that close to saving her, which would probably ultimately inflict the most amount of pain. Anyway, I just felt the need to express this because it's lingering in the back of my mind. Is it likely right now? No, it is very unlikely, but it's fun. And it works really well with the big theory that we're slowly creeping up on. But the last thing that I want to throw into the pot is there was a really strange detail within all of this that caught my attention and I think should catch your attention. Aerys tells Rocks that if it looks like they're going to catch me, I'll kill, teach, and end my own life. So let's each find a way to survive and we can meet again in Llosia. She specifically said Llosia, which is fascinating. Guys, in my opinion, Oda has kept this overt, but also fairly obscured. There is a lot of current story connections between Blackbeard and the country of Llosia. In one of the very early cover stories following Ace and his pursuit of Blackbeard, Ace heard of a town in Llosia where Blackbeard had been seen. We know this because Ace eventually meets a character named Moda, who was more recently confirmed to be from the country of Llosia, so this is where Ace was. There's also additional story between the country of Llosia and the Peachbeard pirates, who were subordinate to Blackbeard. And as a side note, I find it interesting at the very least that obviously with Llosia, another strong connection is the Revolutionary Army, and Blackbeard also kind of made a point in the story to target the Revolutionary Army and eventually ends up finding their base in Baltica. But I would just say that I think that we have enough to at least speculate that there might be a connection between Blackbeard and Llosia, which, given what Aerys says in this chapter, is extremely interesting. Firstly, we don't actually know what happens to Blackbeard following God Valley, but now it is at the very least a possibility that Blackbeard does end up making it to Llosia as Aerys and Rocks had planned. Following God Valley was Blackbeard raised in Llosia. When you say this at first, I don't think that it'll jump off the page to you, right? Like it's just a fun idea, you know, maybe that's where Blackbeard was raised. Not that important of a thing, but could come up. Until you think too much about it, and then you go, wait a second, if Blackbeard ended up in Llosia as Aerys and Rocks had planned, we know that Rocks dies in God Valley. Did Aerys survive? Did she uphold her part of the bargain with Rocks? I hope you guys realize at the very least that this is like the one thing I feel like nobody would want to speculate right now. I mean, I feel like if I talk to basically anyone, I haven't talked to everyone, but I assume that if I did, the consensus is that probably Aerys died, and this is related to what ultimately happens to Rocks. That should be the feeling that we all have. So if Aerys actually survived and took teach to Llosia, that would be a crazy twist. So let's break it down even further. Why exactly would this be a crazy twist? Well, it's because I think, currently, at least this is true for me, Aerys dying is part of how I make sense of God Valley right now. We know that eventually Garp and Roger team up to fight Rocks, who, as we argued at the beginning of this review, is basically the hero right now. I think that we as a fandom need Roger to have a very, very good reason to fight Rocks to the death, and this is currently lacking. So if you've been following the chapter reviews, which have been a wild roller coaster, by the way, but if you've been following, right, the last theory that we made, the current headcanon before now, is that Aerys dies and Rocks is literally driven insane. May or may not be the case, but at least I can envision how God Valley might end. And also, it's just a theory that intuitively makes sense because I think that we can picture how this would be an emotional shot to the gut that Oda likes to drop in flashbacks, you know? So narratively, it stands out as something worthy of writing. So I just want you guys to file this away. If Blackbeard ends up with a connection to Llosia, how exactly did this come about? Is it really purely coincidence if Aerys and Rocks both die here, that he ends up at the place that they intended to take him? And another thing to point out, just so that we're clear, is Llosia is not just the nearest island to God Valley that it would make sense for anybody to escape to. God Valley is in the West Blue, and Llosia is in the Grand Line, which further begs questions about Llosia itself. Why is it that Aerys thought Llosia was the place that they needed to go? Was there something in Llosia that matters? Could this also relate to Emu's decision to wipe Llosia off the map? So in one of the prior chapter reviews, a theory that I still really like, I think that it's cool, is that there are two different sort of poneglyphs in the world of One Piece. There's the normal poneglyphs that you would think of that were essentially made by Joy Boy or Joy Boy's friends and describe Joy Boy's story and prophecies related to him. But one of the interesting factoids about Blackbeard, which relates him to Nico Robin, is Oda says that if he wasn't a pirate, he would be a scholar, an archaeologist. Then you start thinking about Blackbeard's father, Rocks, and you realize Rocks knows so much more about the world than he really should. It's almost as if he's been reading the poneglyphs. Maybe not all of them, but enough of them to have a grasp of the state of the world, as well as the existence of particular devil fruit which seemed to be important, one of which he thought that King Harold needed to eat, likely the Nika fruit. But like, did he discover this by following the poneglyphs like Roger and like Luffy is doing currently? Like, we don't see that story, but we can reason that he simply knows too much. So my theory is that there is a second set of quote-unquote poneglyphs which do not tell the story of Joy Boy, they tell the story of Davy Jones. Essentially, there is one set of poneglyphs which describe Joy Boy as the hero of the story, and there is another set which describe Davy Jones as the hero of the story. And this other Rio poneglyph was perhaps protected by the Davy clan. The Davy clan knew where it was. So going back to the idea that in an alternate universe, Blackbeard would be an archaeologist, right? You can parallel Nico Robin and Blackbeard. Nico Robin is the last remaining scholar of Ohara. Scholars of Ohara were attempting to connect and find all of the poneglyphs. I believe Blackbeard might be the last remaining scholar of God Valley, or scholar of Davy Jones, carrying the will of his people or the will of God Valley. This theory is also awesome in my opinion because it would make you think about God Valley differently. It would make you directly parallel it to Ohara. Perhaps secretly, not yet revealed to us, is the world government's agenda to destroy the scholars of God Valley here. This is actually the first iteration of Ohara. But they couldn't order a buster call because they couldn't reveal like any aspect of what is actually happening, so instead they plan a hunting game. Another method to achieve the very same thing: buster call, hunting game, kill everybody. Anyway, based on this theory, I just want to speculate that the Davy clan's Rio poneglyph, where they stored all the information that they had gathered over the centuries, was in Llosia. Llosia was their version of Laugh-Tale. And if Blackbeard really does have history in Llosia, it'd be easier to speculate something that I just genuinely believe to be true, that Blackbeard, from the very start of the story, even before he joined the Whitebeard Pirates, maybe knew more than he ever let on. His goal from the start has been the very same as his father, Rocks D. Zebek, whose will he has inherited. His goal has something to do with worshipping Davy Jones. But like Rock suggests, he also knows about Nika. Another thing that I want to make sure that I point out, and we brought this up I think in the last few chapter reviews, but just doubling down here. Garp brings up the idea of justice, and I think that justice as a concept, philosophically, is something that we should be thinking about. What does justice mean? What is justice? Why can't justice for me be the same thing as justice for everybody else? Why does it pick favorites? So the idea that we brought up, I think 2 chapter reviews ago, is that there's this balance between saving the innocent and prosecuting the guilty. Or perhaps in a more One Piece way, right? Saving your friends versus destroying your enemies. The more aggressively you prosecute the guilty, the more likely you are to accidentally prosecute the innocent. This is sort of what absolute justice represents in the story, is the extreme to one side of this, where the innocent literally do not matter if evil is destroyed. A lot of actual people in the world subscribe to this philosophy whether they acknowledge it or not, because it is the most effective way to eliminate what you perceive to be evil. If you punish 100% of people that are accused of murder, you will very quickly eliminate the vast majority of murderers from the world. But the cost for this is all of the innocent people that were accused of murder, they didn't actually do it. As far as absolute justice is concerned, they do not care. So honestly, I believe the flip side to absolute justice was described in this chapter. This was the philosophy of Ivankov. Ivankov tells Kuma to eat the fruit and save yourself. We just need one survivor, and then we've won. For absolute justice, victory is explained as destroying all evil, no matter the cost. But for Ivankov, victory is achieved with one survivor. So this is just something for you to think about. But to throw my own agenda in here as well, I kind of think that both Ivankov and someone like Akainu, who represents absolute justice, or the Celestial Dragons and Imu, both of these perspectives are probably not ideal as far as One Piece is concerned. Luffy does not define victory as destroying all of his enemies or saving just one person. Luffy defines victory as saving everybody that he wants to, or his friends who need and want his help, which sort of relates back to Aerys and Rayleigh. I also think that it's this conversation that does the most to bring all of this chapter together. What we're seeing, like panel after panel, scene after scene, it's about saving people. Rayleigh saves Shocki. Ivankov saves Kuma. Kuma then goes on to save a whole lot of other people. Garp questions justice. Who should he be saving? Rocks saves Aerys, but then Aerys saves Rocks. Later on, we get this split panel of Aerys saving Blackbeard, while Dragon saves Shanks. But also, we skipped this one earlier. As Rayleigh is saving Shocki, then Roger attempts to save Rayleigh. Hold the line sort of thing. Also, Shiki saved Shocki as well. And perhaps the last example of all of this is in the middle of this chapter, Kaido finally acquires the Dragon Devil Fruit, and using this power at the end of the chapter along with Whitebeard is perhaps saving Rocks. The only character's actions in the entire story that do not appear as though it is about saving people relates to Imu, and by extension his subordinates such as Garling. Imu wants to kill Rocks, but soon we will be questioning this as well. So guys, all the buildup has led to this moment. We're going to spend the end of this chapter review making a big theory that might blow your mind. But to explain this best, I might first need to talk about Dragon Quest. How many of you guys out there have actually played Dragon Quest? I just know anecdotally it doesn't seem like the most popular game outside of Japan, but within Japan itself, it's a huge cultural phenomenon. You know, like they always memed about with Togashi and his health, like, oh, he's just playing Dragon Quest. Not dunking on Togashi, just saying Dragon Quest is a big deal in Japan. And I can't say that I exactly know the reason why this is the case, but I can speculate, and my theory is that Dragon Quest kind of represents Japanese culture in a way that would be really hard for outsiders to understand. I also think that the same thing is true of One Piece. Almost like the spirit or heart of Japan itself is speaking to the rest of the world through the story, through the media, through the entertainment. And this is perhaps a long way of saying that I see a lot of relation between Dragon Quest and One Piece. Hell, I even said in a theory video sometime recently that One Piece might essentially be one big dragon quest, a quest for a dragon that the One Piece treasure, Laugh-Tale, might be found in the belly of a dragon. Also is related to and should remind you of other popular things from Japan, right? Dragon Ball Z and this idea of a wish dragon. The One Piece will grant you a wish if you find it, and it's associated the same as Dragon Ball with the dragon. So the whole story is a quest for the dragon. I also just want to point out here that the original Dragon Quest game came out in 1986, which is pretty much the perfect time period for this to be a game that heavily inspired Oda's entire creative direction, right? This is a game that he would have played probably a lot as a child. On the same level as other inspirations that we've talked about throughout the course of the channel, like Laputa Castle in the Sky. But just talking about the first game, the branding of Dragon Quest, deciding to name it Dragon Quest is interesting because essentially the premise of it is that the dragon is the great evil in the world that the hero must eventually confront. So spiritually, you can look at it as the dragon represents the evil in the world, and that to restore peace or balance in the world, you must defeat the dragon. That is the quest. And this whole idea might also relate to other mythologies across the world, including European mythologies. Basically, the dragon guards the treasure. To acquire the dragon's treasure, you must slay it. The dragon, therefore, is this, if you're thinking in One Piece terms, this king of the world sort of figure that has acquired everything that the world has to offer. But obviously, there have been many other iterations of Dragon Quest since the first one, and as each version is created, the idea of it, I think, gets spelled out more clearly. It's obviously a story about good versus evil, but you can break this up in a lot of ways. You can think about this like creation versus destruction, or ruin versus renewal. Like Dragon Quest stories typically revolve around a hero or a group of heroes tasked with saving the world from some sort of malevolent force, often like a demon lord or godlike entity bent on destruction. The antagonists seek to unravel the world's order, or spread chaos, corrupt civilizations, annihilate life, that sort of thing. While the hero's journey, which is also something we talk a lot about regarding One Piece, the hero's journey is about creation and restoring balance, rebuilding societies, uniting people, fostering hope. The cycle of destruction by the villain and the creation aspect by the hero forms the narrative backbone, symbolizing the eternal struggle to rebuild what is broken. Or phrased in a different way, take something that has been shattered into many different pieces and make it whole once again, one piece. But I suppose that the reason why I think that these sorts of stories are very integral to Japanese culture is they draw heavily from Shinto and Buddhist themes, where destruction and creation are not opposites, but part of life, like a natural cycle. A sort of yin and yang thing, right? Two parts of one whole. Like the worlds of Dragon Quest often depict landscapes scarred by destruction, like ruined castles or cursed villages, desolate wastelands. But if you play the games as you progress, you eventually revive towns, restore cursed inhabitants, uncover lost histories. Basically, creation rises from destruction's ashes. All of this reflects the concept of samsara from Buddhism, the cycle of death and rebirth. And I think that all of this is heavily related to One Piece as well. Another kind of mythology that we bring up often, especially in the middle of Elbaf, is Norse mythology. And Oda clearly loves Norse mythology. He literally said that the Viking was his favorite thing growing up, right? That mythology shares the same themes. Ragnarok, this great world-scale war, is not just the beginning of the end. It's also an opportunity to rebuild the world better than it was before. So anyway, let's get into the theory and discuss the later iterations of Dragon Quest. I believe that if you look at the final antagonists of most of these games, it could give you a few snapshots of what might end up happening in One Piece, something very similar. In Dragon Quest II, you had this evil demon named Malroth, whose essence is pure chaos, and he aimed to plunge the world into darkness and ruin. Malroth is this godlike entity that exists beyond the mortal plane. He has absolutely no redeeming qualities or motives beyond destruction itself. But what's interesting about Malroth is the final villain of the series, sort of. But is also just like not a real character. It's really just an embodiment of evil. The actual antagonistic character throughout the storyline is Hargon, who presided over this group called the Cult of Hargon. Hargon was a powerful sorcerer and leader, and his objective was to bring about the end of the world by summoning Malroth. He was able to summon Malroth through a dark ritual fueled by sorcery and sacrifice. But even thinking about Malroth as an evil being isn't quite correct, and I think that Dragon Quest Builders 2, which if you're not aware is the Dragon Quest version of Minecraft, this sort of explores this particular story more, where Malroth does not appear as this world-destroying creature. Malroth is an actual character in that game that you, the hero, the builder of creation, right? You befriend Malroth. All of this tying back to the theme, the yin and yang of creation and destruction as being natural parts of life in the world. So the idea is that destruction isn't innately evil, right? The people who worship destruction above creation and want to destroy everything, those people are evil. Hargon is the real villain here. You can also tie this back to One Piece and perhaps the ancient weapons. We got a line from Queen Otohime to Shirahoshi when she was a child, right? But she was explaining the powers of Poseidon. Poseidon, similar to Malroth, is like this thing which has the potential to destroy the world. A lot of people view the ancient weapons as weapons, but Otohime tells Shirahoshi, one day you will meet somebody who will be able to guide you to use your powers for good. Similar to our conversation about creation and destruction, weapons are not just tools to inflict harm onto others. Weapons can be tools to protect and save the ones that you love. So the user and the context matters. But anyway, let's continue with this Dragon Quest end of game opponents. Zoma is the primary antagonist of Dragon Quest III. And Zoma is this demonic overlord who seeks to envelop the world in eternal darkness. Importantly, Zoma is from the Dark World, which is this parallel realm, and their existence is defined by their desire to destroy hope and light, casting the world into despair. A near omnipotent being who thrives on suffering. Also, as a side note, Zoma's power is so immense that he literally warps reality, creating a realm of perpetual night. Another great example of a type of being that we want to talk about is Orgodemir from Dragon Quest VII. This is another demon lord who seeks to destroy the world, but this time to remake it in his image. This character is much more similar to how you would view the devil. Cunning and manipulative, orchestrating and sealing the entire continents into time-locked fragments to prevent resistance. So you can think about it like Orgodemir exists in a realm where time no longer exists. But this is a guy who physically devastates lands, but also spiritually corrupts humanity, turning people into monsters. The origin story for this guy is that he's tied to a cosmic struggle against the Almighty, or the game's creator deity, whom he battles for dominion. There's also Nocturnus from Dragon Quest VI, Demon King, power synonymous with annihilation. He's actually not the main antagonist of this game. It's an optional super boss that is even harder than the actual main antagonist. But his lore portrays him as a near mythical entity who exists to challenge and destroy the strongest beings with no allegiance or purpose beyond proving his dominance through obliteration. Nocturnus is another godlike figure, this monster, literally created by darkness to embody raw destructive power, like a manifestation of primal chaos. And then I think the last one we're going to bring up is Corvus from Dragon Quest IX. Corvus was originally a Celestian, like a guardian angel-like being. Corvus falls from grace after being betrayed by humans, transforming into a being of pure malice bent on destroying the world. So look, I'm sure that you understand that some of these games were released after One Piece had already begun, some of them predate One Piece. It's not important like the specifics of when these games were created, right? They spiritually have a lot of similarities to One Piece because they both reflect Japanese culture. And the main idea that I want to drive home that exists within the Dragon Quest universe is this idea of primal, godlike entities that are brought into our world from other realms. If you're starting to catch on, we've seen something similar to this in related One Piece media within the past few years. You could think about, for instance, Kanjuro at the end of Wano. But for the most explicit example, watch Film Red. In Film Red, you had this being, this creature, called Tot Musica, a cataclysmic embodiment of destruction tied to music and human negativity, the Demon King of Songs. So just so that we're clear here, right, Tot Musica is this otherworldly monster born from the manifestation of people's negative emotions such as hatred, despair, and sorrow. It's not sentient, it doesn't have its own agenda, it's a mindless, destructive entity that amplifies chaos and suffering. I should very much hope that at this point in time, a being such as this should sound very, very familiar to you, because this is basically all of the antagonists of Dragon Quest as well. But let's dig a little bit deeper into the lore. Tot Musica was sealed beneath the island of Elegia centuries ago by an ancient user of the Uta Uta no Mi, or the sing fruit from that movie, a fruit which grants the user the ability to manipulate reality through song. The entity is linked to a forbidden sheet of music inscribed with ancient runic alphabet, which contains the incantation to summon it. So this is literally a song of death. So why was it sealed away beneath this particular island? Well, the kingdom of Elegia was once a haven for music and art, and it's in this place of great advancement in music that they stumbled upon this forbidden song. In this way, this music is almost like a technology that the kingdom of Elegia discovered and accidentally unleashed upon the world. I hope you guys see the parallels here. We're not going to enumerate them all. So it's about here that we might drop ourselves a game changer. Sandman reported that in 2022, during a special voice commentary by Oda that could only be heard in theaters in Japan, he mentioned that a being like Tot Musica also existed in the One Piece manga, but he has not yet drawn it. So now let's take ourselves back to One Piece chapter 1162. Emu asks Saturn, is Rocks dead? Saturn says, I could not say, this is all so unexpected. If anything, there is a danger that such wanton destruction might bring about the birth of something entirely new. And Emu says, that must not happen. Emu then proceeds to possess Saturn's body and becomes much more directly involved in the conflict in God Valley. So look guys, I think that you already know what I'm about to speculate, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it anyway. We began this review with observations that at this point in time it's pretty definitive that Rocks is now the hero, he's not the villain. But we know that eventually Garp and Roger team up to defeat Rocks, and the circumstances of why this would happen don't make a whole lot of sense to us at this moment. The story has very much gripped me. Why does it make sense? I assume that it makes sense, but why? Currently I'm wondering if these circumstances in God Valley have unintentionally cultivated a scenario where a being from another realm will be summoned. I'm wondering whether or not Rocks will transform into some sort of primordial evil being of destruction. And I'm not gonna lie guys, and I know that I say this every week, but we're gonna say it again this week, I've pretty well convinced myself that this is a very valid thought. If you really need to, feel free to rewatch this entire review with this speculation at the end in mind. And suddenly, a lot of things that we're not sure make sense make a lot more sense. We can even highlight another thing that, from this chapter, I was wrong about, or at least currently I'm wrong about. I assumed, and I still kind of assume this to be true, but I assumed that at some point in time, Rocks would be betrayed by literally his entire crew, but the end of this chapter couldn't be more opposite to that because now you have Dragon Kaido and Whitebeard at his side. Big Mom's not here, the other people I'm not entirely sure, but you know, it's like reality is different from our initial expectations. But if we are looking for circumstances which might lead Kaido and Whitebeard to betray Rocks, then transforming into this being of pure evil might be among those things. Oda could also interrelate this with the lore and history of the DAVY clan, like this is something that was uniquely possible for Rocks, and therefore might also be uniquely possible for Blackbeard. To go back to our references to other famous Japanese media, Dragon Ball, right? And how the Saiyans transform into giant destructive apes under very particular circumstances or when subjected to very particular energies. In this case, the energy of the full moon, which also has something related in the story of One Piece. Mink Sulong. Also, Captain Kuro describes something very, very similar at damn near the very beginning of this story. He says the crescent moon fills him with bloodlust. It somehow turns him into a demon, which is also something reflected within this chapter as members of the DAVY clan have literally become demons. I'm not saying that what has happened to Rocks' family is what is going to happen to him, although that is a possibility as well. I'm just saying that they're philosophically potentially related. Like, we might see Rocks become literally a demon, but in a different way. A primordial demon king of death, destruction, and darkness. And for sure would explain why Garp and Roger would team up to defeat Rocks and why the world doesn't actually know the real story. This was an event that was very intentionally erased from history. Would also really help explain why Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard never wanted to talk about Rocks after this day. Then, if you really want to, you can go back to Elbaf's mural, right? The mural which describes like the lore of the world. In it, you have a being that might be a representation of this. And then suddenly you're starting to question, well, if such a thing might exist, a top musica-like being exists in the world of One Piece, was it summoned in prior worlds, literally leading to those worlds' destruction? Seems pretty likely to me. But then after all of this, you really start questioning every thought that you've ever had, because we'll turn back to what Imu and Saturn were discussing in this chapter. If what I've said here, if we assume it to be true, then Imu is essentially, I guess, indicating that this being's appearance might be likely, and that is not what they want. They are trying to stop this. So just the same as pretty much every other character in this story, is Imu actually motivated to save the world or save the people from this that nobody knows about. I bet all of you were thinking that when I brought up the cult of Hargon and Malroth from Dragon Quest, you thought, oh, Hargon, that's very similar to Imu and all the other iterations of Dragon Quest. This being is often, described with devil-like abilities and character traits, and this obviously represents Imu. But here, we are perhaps arguing that Imu is not that character. They are trying to stop this being from appearing. Perhaps the actual antagonist is, for instance, Blackbeard or Rocks, or even a guy like Luffy. Regardless of their intention, the person who might discover this great danger to the world and unleash it, unshackle it. Think about Luffy and Loki and Elbaf. Think about how Tot Musica was created because society was advancing. Think about the Roger Pirates and Roger and Rayleigh. They found Laugh Tale, they found the One Piece, they found everything, and afterwards, they weren't entirely sure what they should do about it. So look, I understand how I'm flipping the entire story of One Piece on its head, and it's a lot to grapple with, so I'm gonna leave it for you to grapple with on your own as I do the same. I felt like this hit me. I was talking to a friend, Andrew, about this, and then suddenly it's just like, wait a second. I really do hope that the end of this video met your expectations, and I would honestly love to discuss it more in the comment section below. Let me know what you guys think. As always, if you're interested, check out my book of the Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.